cleansing being carried out by security forces from the neighboring Amhara region. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch has said. The two rights group, in a joint report released today, detailed how Tigrayan civilians in the disputed western Tigray zone of the country are allegedly being killed and subjected to various forms of sexual violence and abuses, including rape. Some of the Tigrayans also faced mass detention and forcible movements, a campaign that, along with the other reported abuses mentioned, amounts to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, joining me in studio to talk about this report is Laetitia, who's the Horn of Africa Director at the Human Rights Watch. Good afternoon, Laetitia. We're definitely not meeting on good news in the backdrop of this particular report. Let's start from there. What exactly is happening within Ethiopia's Western Tigray zone? Because according to your report, the government or the necessary people have committed widespread abuses against Tigrayans, and that's since November 2020.
We've conducted over 400 interviews with survivors and witnesses of the most harrowing abuses in Western Tigray zone over the last year. What we document are waves of abuses, starting with war crimes which were committed by the Ethiopian federal government forces alongside Amhara forces in the initial few weeks of the conflict in Tigray. And this targeted the Western Tigray zone at the time. And then what we started to see was basically Amhara regional forces and an administration coming in, starting to administer the area, but in the process started what we would find to be this campaign of ethnic cleansing. So widespread abuses as part of that campaign, sexual violence, mass detention in the most horrific conditions, and this in many ways is one of the most pressing ongoing human rights concerns. We are talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of primarily men who we believe to be in life-threatening conditions in detention facilities in Western Tigray zone as we speak. We then started to see deprival of their means of survival. This is a very fertile area, and in the first 2 months of the conflict we saw widespread looting, destruction of crops, also some entire villages were destroyed, were burnt. And then after that, Tigrayans were denied what little humanitarian assistance was going in. And from about December 2020 onwards, we then started to see this campaign of forced expulsions. So hundreds were expulsed directly from detention facilities, whereas others were forced onto buses and made to cross into other parts of Tigray. So what we say is this was an organized campaign of ethnic cleansing, and the abuses we document in this report amount to crimes against humanity. Okay, I'm falling short rather of asking who exactly is the perpetrator, but if I get you right, in this particular case, hunger is being used as a weapon of oppression, especially in this particular area. Who's orchestrating this? So the issue of deprivation of means of survival, food, etc., was one of the many tools used against this Tigrayan population. So what we identify 3 individuals in particular from the Amhara security and officials who need to be immediately suspended and investigated for these crimes, both because of command responsibility and direct involvement in these abuses. But here we're also talking about responsibility by the federal government forces, both in the initial phases, but also on the ongoing deportations. We document cases of federal government forces actually accompanying these buses where people were being forced away from their homes. Also in the detention facilities, especially in the early phases, federal government, military and also police were controlling some of these detention facilities. So the responsibility obviously lies both at the level of the regional government and amongst individuals, but also at the highest level as well.
Looking at the conflict from outside looking in, especially to Kenyans who are watching right now, we're talking about a head of state who definitely got a Nobel Peace Prize not too long ago. And this time round, we're hearing reports of federal government forces perhaps being part of this ethnic cleansing, which is quite unfortunate. What exactly is the government saying, especially the federal government, in response to this? Because I'm pretty sure the pressure from various international players is definitely knocking on his door.
Well, we're obviously calling for ongoing investigations into what has been happening here. There has been a lot of denial. When the first reports of the abuses that were trickling out of Western Tigray, I think it's very important to underline, this is a region where there are no independent eyes and ears on the ground as we speak. There are very few international humanitarian actors there. So this has been very much hidden off from the world. But when information was trickling out, there's been a lot of denial, and from the federal government and from the regional forces. And this is where it's really important. This is a contested area. This is an area where the future of this area may take months, if not years, to resolve. But there are pressing protection concerns as we speak. And this is where the government of Kenya, amongst other governments in the region who are involved in potentially discussing negotiations going forward, need to make sure that the protection issues in Western Tigray are central to these discussions. There are clear issues around accountability that need to be central to any political discussions going forward as well. But as part of this report, we're also calling on warring parties, as part of any negotiated settlement, to support the deployment of an AU-led international peacekeeping force into this region. People there need protection, and that's why there needs to be a neutral force there.
Well, that's interesting to note. What about the concerned countries, Kenya included? What role can we play in terms of the bilateral ties to ensure that some of these atrocities are not occurring right next to our border?
No, absolutely. I mean, it's obvious that there have been many serious crimes committed in the conflict in northern Ethiopia. And it's absolutely essential that neighbouring countries continue to support international and regional investigations into the serious abuses that have happened. But at the same time, it's also essential for regional governments to put pressure on the Ethiopian government to immediately stop the abuses which are happening now. There are a whole range of recommendations around the demobilization of some of the militia forces which have been implicated in this campaign of ethnic cleansing, but there is also a whole part of investigations which need to happen of the implication of federal government forces as well. And, you know, the whole question of accountability, and even more so when it comes to the question of Western Tigray. In many ways, this has been the elephant in the room that many actors have been reluctant to take on. It is contested, it is complicated, but what we are saying here is that it cannot be ignored. There are people whose very lives are at risk right now. This cannot be ignored anymore.
Definitely, action needs to be taken, and perhaps that AU-led peacekeeping mission that you had mentioned would be a proper way to counter this. And now, from what I'm getting, perhaps we don't want to point fingers specifically at the Ethiopian federal and allied forces, because I can recall during the initial days of this offensive, especially in 2020, some of the Tigrayan militias were equally accused of crimes against humanity, especially towards the Amhara residents. What exactly are we getting, especially as Human Rights Watch and other organizations that are present in Ethiopia, in terms of the conflict situation, so we don't compound blame on one side while the other is barely being noticed?
I mean, in terms of abuses in Western Tigray, we document in detail what happened in the town of Maikadra, where there was the first large-scale mass killings of civilians that was documented. So we look into the events on November 9, where there was an initial series of mass killings by Tigrayans, militias and local community members against Amhara residents and day laborers in that town. And then we look at the aftermath of this, when there were also reprisal killings by federal government forces, Amhara forces, that came in just the next day into that town against Tigrayans, and also started a campaign of mass arrests. And as I mentioned, the first deportations of Tigrayans from Western Tigray actually happened from the Maikadra facilities, detention facilities, in December 2020. In terms of broader abuses by Tigrayan forces, we've documented what amount to war crimes as well against Eritrean refugees in Tigray. More recently, we have documented cases of extrajudicial executions in 2 towns in particular in the Amhara region. So this is why, as an organization, we have continued to press for there to be ongoing international investigations to ensure that all the victims who continue to suffer, I mean, I think this is where it's important to underline there are massive humanitarian needs in northern Ethiopia right now. In terms of Tigray in particular, there are ongoing widespread obstructions of humanitarian assistance. Services are still being denied. There have been no banking services. There have been no electricity in Tigray for much of the last 17 months, which obviously is denying people's access to basic means of survival as well. So we are talking about ongoing suffering that need to be documented, and those most responsible need to be held to account.
And that's really proper. As we conclude, perhaps, is there any urgency from the government or whichever stakeholder in terms of demobilizing and disarming some of these abusive militia forces that are present in Ethiopia as we speak?
I mean, this is obviously something we're calling for specifically for Amhara militia in the region of Western Tigray. There have already been some discussions around that, some attempts to start. These are not the first abuses which have been documented by these militia forces, and we are calling for the demobilization, demilitarization of the forces which are in Western Tigray zone per se and have been implicated in these serious abuses.
Well, thank you so much, Laetitia Bada, right there, the Horn of Africa Director and Human Rights Watch, just highlighting what is encompassed in a recently released report that highlights the ethnic cleansing, unfortunately, that is happening within Western Ethiopia region, especially affecting some communities, including the Tigrayans as well. Would definitely push for more, opinion, especially from international players around